This is United States History 202, Presentation 10, the Progressive Ethos. So what we're going to talk about here is the idea of progress, the intellectual basis of progress. We talked about technology in the last presentation. And technology is an important part of this drive of the people thinking about progress. You know, as you have more and more gadgets, you think, well, we're becoming more progressive. But there's an intellectual basis for that, and we're going to talk about it in this presentation. So the progressive ethos, again, is the idea of progress. A simple definition is that every day man is getting better in every way. So this was what people were saying in the early 20th century, late 19th century, but more early 20th century. Every day man is getting better in every way. And it's really rooted in philosophy and science. And it affects every aspect of American life, including politics, religion, education, social interaction. Its origins can be found in Europe. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the European philosophers that had an impact in the United States. And we'll start with Herbert Spencer. An English philosopher said that progress was a positive. In other words, every aspect of society can progress. This is called positivism. It's a firm reliance on science and ultimately a rejection of religion. So every aspect of society can progress. And of course, we'll get into evolution in a second. But everything, whether it's government, whether it's education, whether it's social interaction, all these things can progress. Technology, leisure, everything progresses. At the same time, though, Spencer was a firm believer in a Darwinistic theory of human nature. So he believed in survival of the fittest. In other words, only the fittest individuals or things survive this process of evolution. So he is actually the one who coined that phrase, not Charles Darwin, who we'll talk about in 1 second. So Herbert Spencer is going to have a dramatic impact in the way people think about business, economy, government. Spencer's a much forgotten but more important individual in some ways than Charles Darwin in terms of the practical application of evolution. So here's Charles Darwin, English philosopher, scientist, wrote a couple of important books on the origin of the species, where he outlined evolution and natural selection, and then the descent of man, where he said that man evolved from apes. So basically what he's saying in both of these books is that everything evolves over time. You know, the giraffe didn't start out with a long neck, it started with something else, and its neck got longer. People evolved from apes. So this is in stark contrast to creationism, where man is created in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and you go from there. He's saying, no, everything evolved over time. We're only here because of a process, a natural process. So this is a controversial theory in the late 19th century, because most of the world was still operating under a creationist theory. And when this thing comes over the United States, we'll talk about in the 1920s, there actually was a very famous trial where evolution and creation went on trial against each other. Now, Darwinism in practice. So on one side you had the conservative Darwinists. This was applied by businessmen, i.e. the robber barons, we already talked about in Presentation 6. This is the survival of the fittest. Man controls nature, industry has progressed, and so because these people have a lot of money, they believe that they were the most fit. So this is used to justify their status in society. So Herbert Spencer is their guy. But if you think about it, man controls nature. Man is so powerful he can control nature. And they're looking at society and they're saying we have these factories and all these things, and we're plowing over forests and doing all these things, so we actually control nature. There's no difference really in the conservative Darwinist position that man controls nature and the modern position of the environmentalist that says man is creating global warming. It's the same thing. On the other side, you would have people say, well, man is not that powerful. Man works in nature, but nature still controls man, because man cannot control everything. We can't control earthquakes. We can't control storms. We can't control this stuff. We might be able to plow down a forest, but we can't control when it's going to rain. We can't control when an earthquake is going to happen or a natural disaster. We just can't control those things. Nature is more powerful than we are. Whatever we build can always be destroyed. But of course, this idea that man is so powerful he can control everything in nature, even make the storm stronger, whatever the case may be, this is coming out of a conservative Darwinist position. So this is progressivism. Nothing has changed. Reform Darwinism. It's a component of modern liberalism. Governments have a duty to control the evils of evolution under this theory. In other words, man can perfect society in the name of justice. So because we know about evolution, we can control evolution. This is a gradual push towards socialism, so everyone's equal. And their guy is a man named Lester Frank Ward, who we'll talk about. There's Lester Frank Ward, a sociologist, one of the founders of modern liberalism. And again, he believed that man could control evolution. Man is so powerful. Man knows about it. So What we need to do is mitigate the evils of evolution. Obviously, evolution, natural selection, you're going to have people that are stronger, smarter, whatever the case may be than others. So what you try to do is level society so that the people that are behind don't get left behind. And this was seen as a more just thing to do. So that term justice comes out. This is justice. This is humanitarianism, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're going to use government to do that. You're going to use government to level society. That was the idea. Of course, that fits right into the Marxist dialectic and the Marxist ideology. So Karl Marx was a German socialist. Basically came up with the idea. Well, socialism was around before Marx, but he's the one that really codified this idea of political socialism or revolutionary socialism. His two most important books were the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. Basically what he said was that the world devolved into class struggles. So if you look at the four stages of human society, which led to communism, whether it's feudalism, capitalism, socialism, then communism, essentially you have conflict between each one of those stages, and ultimately, in his mind, the state would wither away. You would no longer need the state when you're at a stage of communism because everyone owned, the people owned everything, there's no need for money, everyone's equal, there's no need for property. So you have a perfect utopian society at that point. So Marx is a utopian in so many ways, and we'll talk about utopians in a few minutes. But Marx was very controversial in his own time. He was targeted for arrest, causing all kinds of political problems throughout Europe. He had to live under assumed names and off the backs of others. Basically, Marx was a historian, and he spent his time writing these books that led to theories of class struggle and, of course, political revolution. He actually coined terms like capitalism and racism, and these are things that Marx came up with to differentiate society. So you play identity politics against each other. This is the Marxist dialectic. There's the poor, there's the rich, there's this race, this religion, that religion, and so all politics is just struggle between these different groups. Now, as far as socialism in the United States, it wasn't called socialism. It was either called gradualism, liberalism, progressivism. And what they did is they believed in something called permeation. They understood that Americans wouldn't take socialism. If you said, look, I'm a socialist, here's what we're going to do. So what they wanted to do was call themselves something else and then infiltrate other groups. And when you infiltrate those other groups, you push a socialist message and eventually they become socialist. So you join the local Rotary Club or the Republican Party or the Democrat Party and you say, all right, we're going to push a socialist message, and eventually everyone buys it. That's permeation. And that's exactly what happens in the United States. A very famous American socialist was a guy named Henry George from California. Wrote a book entitled Progress and Poverty, where he outlined something called a single tax. In essence, all land and the profit on that land should be taxed at one rate, 100%, and all the proceeds, the profits, then should go into a pot, and everyone should be that money should be distributed out equally among the people. There was one particular community that tried this, actually in the state of Alabama. It was Fairhope, Alabama. And Fairhope is still around. They don't use a single tax idea anymore, but this was a utopian community there near the Gulf of Mexico, and the idea was to have the single tax applied. And people will say this thing worked very well, but again, they don't do this anymore. But, 100% tax on land and the profits on that land. So if you had a factory, you would make zero profit. But essentially you were renting the land from the government. So the idea was, well, why even build a factory if you're not going to make any money? Edward Bellamy was a utopian socialist. He wrote a book entitled Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, where the story is a guy wakes up in 2000, he went to sleep in 1887, and life is completely different in Boston, Massachusetts. There's no class, there's no money, doctors make as much as waiters. So life is completely different. There's no social strife. This is a utopian novel, and far-fetched in so many ways, but it became very popular. You had what were called progressive societies and nationalist clubs pop up. Progressive society is what he advocated, but nationalist clubs would pop up, and he actually called it nationalism. He didn't call it socialism or progressivism. He called it nationalism. So this made it more palatable. Everyone's one people idea. And so this book sold quite a lot of copies, and it was a bestseller. And so people started reading it and thinking, well, we want a progressive society just like this, and so that's what they started aiming for. So progressivism linked the government to the idea of progress. Reform became synonymous with democracy and nationalism. Government could perfect and reform society, in other words, make society progress. So that's when you hear we're making society progress, the government is setting the bar as to what progress means, and they could then perfect and reform society in that process. A component of progressivism was something called pragmatism. This is the philosophy of doing without philosophy or without idealism. The world is in a constant state of flux. The pragmatist will adapt and change to fit the world, so this is relative, right? So everything becomes relative. The truth of any thought relied upon the results of acting on that thought. And pragmatists could continually try new things to fix society when needed or make society progress. This is the practical application of progressivism. You keep tinkering, and you keep changing things, more legislation, government changes, government creates jobs, government fixes society. This is the idea behind it. And you hear people all the time say this. Well, we need government to do this, government to do that. This is progressivism and pragmatism and in application. Now, as I said, progressivism is going to affect different aspects of society. It will affect education. And the man behind that was named John Dewey. He taught at the Columbia Teachers College. And what he believed in child-centered instruction. The most important thing was the socialization of children and the rejection of traditional education. He actually called schools laboratories. He wanted to replace the nuclear family with the school. And he wanted children to get all of their values from the school itself. And traditional education was bad, so what they needed was something that was child-centered, hands-on, group work, these kind of things. And the values of children became the most important things, not the values of adults. That's too authoritarian. So basically what you get is democracy attached with education and children's values becoming more important than anything else. And by calling schools laboratories, that shows you what he's trying to do. This is social engineering, so socialization, working within groups. And this was seen as a way to level society, if you could do this, and you could replace the family and traditional morals and values with something else. Now, Dewey didn't necessarily advocate it to that extreme, but his disciples did, and this is what's basically happened with the modern education system. The social gospel movement was progressivism in the church. Basically, you use the government to usher in the kingdom of God and transform society to a higher law. This is the early center of reform. Church always has been. So you're going to get government intervention in the economy and much more government activity and moral legislation, meaning we're going to try to abolish alcohol or try to get rid of prostitution or gambling, things like that. That is progressivism through the social gospel movement. So what you have today basically in the United States, when you look at the right and the left, both of them are progressives in their own way. Oftentimes the social right, when they talk about legislation, moral legislation, for example, outlawing prostitution or gambling or alcohol or drugs, it's no different than the progressives who are trying to use government to usher in the kingdom of God or a higher law through equality in finances. Right? Everybody has the same property. Everybody makes the same salary. It's the same type of idea. Now, Francis Bellamy was related to Edward Bellamy. He actually was a cousin, and he was a socialist minister. What a lot of people don't realize is that the United States Pledge of Allegiance was written by socialists for children. The idea was to indoctrinate children to believe in this progressive society. And so if you think about the pledge, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Under God was added later. But one nation, indivisible. So the idea was to say liberty and justice. If you look at the end, justice, this idea of justice, remember that's equality. Equality is justice. One nation, indivisible. So we're one nation, nationalism. So this is the point. So you get children to start saying this thing when they're 5, and they say it until they're all the way through school, and they start believing this nationalist agenda. The Bellamy salute, the way you used to say it, I actually have a picture here. So you used to say it like that. And of course that's more equated with the Nazis, but this is originally how you said the Pledge of Allegiance. It was only changed during World War II. Muckrakers were journalists, and from about 1902 to 1912, they're still around. They just don't call themselves muckrakers anymore. But they wrote in magazines, newspapers, then later novels and books. Big business was the principal target. The idea was to push a progressive agenda. Society is broken. Capitalism is to blame for that. And so government regulation is a solution. And so they were trying to rake up muck, dirt, trying to expose the seedy underside of big business. The most famous muckraker was a man named Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book entitled The Jungle in 1906. This is a socialist treatise designed to influence labor laws. It was sensationalized and fabricated, but now everybody reads this thing and they think, oh my gosh, look how bad the meatpacking industry was. It probably wasn't as bad, and people said it wasn't as bad as Upton Sinclair let on. People didn't have bathrooms and rats in the meat and all kinds of stuff like that. But it did lead to the Pure Food and Drug Act, which we'll talk about in Presentation 12. So Sinclair was a socialist who wanted a socialist agenda, and so he used a book to try to do this, just like Edward Bellamy through Looking Backward. Finally, we have Herbert Croly, a gradualist intellectual who wrote a book entitled The Promise of American Life in 1909. He's considered the father of modern liberalism. Essentially what Croly said was that the Constitution was dead, and what you get is a fusion of Jefferson and Hamilton, creating democracy and aggressive central government. So you get aggressive social programs under the guise of democracy and nationalism, which creates modern liberalism. So that was the idea. This is the promise of American life. You get a much more active central government, a national government doing everything for the people. So Hamilton was great because he believed in an active central government, and Jefferson was great because he was a Democrat, but they have to be put together to create this modern liberalism, which is what we have today. Now, another component, or often confused component, of progressivism is something called populism. Now, populism and progressivism are not the same. They're incorrectly used interchangeably. There were populist progressives, but American populism in particular has a basis in rural America. So they share some of the similar ideas, but not culture. Populism would impact American politics in the 19th and 20th centuries, still does to this day in some ways, but the origins of populism can be found in Thomas Jefferson and John Taylor of Caroline. They distrusted big business and finance, but also big government. And really what happens with progressives and then later some modern populists is they don't distrust big government. They're fine with big government as long as it's regulating big business. But Jefferson and Taylor said both were a problem, particularly the fusion of these two things. You didn't want big government and big business getting in bed together. So this was the agrarian critique of an industrial or commercial society. Populists use phrases like man over money, Wall Street versus Main Street, and farmers. One of the early populists from the South was a man named Tom Watson from Georgia, founder of the Georgia Populist Party. He, in fact, for a time advocated a biracial political party where you had white and black Southern farmers lining together against big business. But eventually Watson became a white supremacist when he figured out that was a more effective way to get elected. And this agrarian populism is going to spread throughout the South and eventually have a profound impact in places like Texas, where you had something called the Farmers Alliance. Mary Lease was also another important populist. It was said that Mary Lease gave the best speeches in the populist era. She used a phrase like a government by Wall Street, for Wall Street. The common people are slaves, and monopoly is the master. And she was the witch figure, or at least that particular figure in The Wizard of Oz by L. Frank Baum. The Wizard of Oz actually is a populist book. Now, Baum denied this, but if you look at the imagery, the yellow brick road, which is gold, you're going to Oz, which is another name for gold. You have the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wicked Witch of the East. And so this is the banking institutions. Dorothy is living in Iowa. Farmers who are going to be kicked off their land. And you have the Tin Man, which is the industrial worker, the Scarecrow, which is the farmer, the Lions. All he needs is courage. These two groups need courage, a brain, and a heart to actually effectively change their life. So it's really a populist look at critique of American society in this time. In fact, the populists would form a political party, the People's Party. Their first presidential candidate was James B. Weaver in 1892, and they had a lot of support in the South and the West. They called for things like a national currency, free silver, an income tax, a postal savings bank. They wanted government ownership of railroads, the telegraph, and the telephone. And they said that all unused land, which was held by corporations, should be returned to the government for redistribution. So they wanted these things because they thought this would be the most effective way to rein in the abuses of government and business aligned together. A postal savings bank is interesting because we had this until the 1960s. And I remember maybe a little while back, there was a guy on a talk show talking about what we need is a postal savings bank, like it was this new idea. And we've already had this thing. It didn't work, so they got rid of it in the 1960s. Here's the 1892 election. You can see the populists have some influence in the West. Now, in 1896, the People's Party will nominate William Jennings Bryan, so the Democrats. So in this case, the populist ideas have overtaken the Democrat Party. In fact, there was a very famous political cartoon where Bryan is swallowing the donkey. So here's the populist snake swallowing the donkey in 1896. So the People's Party was co-opted by the Democrats, and the Democratic Party became more socialist and less conservative, less Cleveland influence in this 96 election. Okay, so that's it for presentation 10. This presentation is very important for your essay, your midterm essay. So you need to bring in some of the ideas of the progressive ethos there, and we'll talk about imperialism in the next presentation. Okay, see you then.